Well, it's lovely to see you all joining us again for Behavioural Science Club. And I'm delighted to introduce this week's guest, Paramasaran Venkataraman, who said that we may call him Param, even though I'd spent the last 10 minutes desperately practicing how to pronounce his name. So, Param, I'm delighted to have you as a guest this week because I was just saying to Prakash that I can remember your panel conversation with Param, with Sony in NowFest. I think there was Param, Sony, there was, who we've had as a guest here. There was Rahil Wakar from White Rice, who we've had as a guest here. Steve Udit, who often joins us and we'll have to have on as a speaker himself. So I'm delighted to have you here. We're going to be talking about all things design. And for those of you who don't know Param, he has been described as an anchor of design thinking in India. I don't know what you think of that description, Param. He's a super background of experience. GE Healthcare, IDEO, Dr. Reddy's Lab, which is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in India, currently head of design with Fractal Analytics. You are very welcome, Param.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly, Param.
Awesome. Thank you, Luis. Really appreciate the introduction, and thank you to you and Prakash to invite me here. It's amazing to see so many people joining for this session on a Saturday evening, late Saturday night in India. Thank you all for showing up, and super honored to be here. And I'm not a behavior science expert. Let me put that out there right now. But I'm learning, and have had the privilege to work with a bunch of super smart behavioral science practitioners in my team, and I'm still learning. And yeah, I'm glad to be here and look forward to having a good conversation and learning from all of you.
Thanks, Param. Well, I'm sure everybody would be interested to hear about your journey into design, and in particular, whilst you might not describe yourself as a behavioural science expert, one of the things that particularly struck me in your conversation with Param, it was probably about this time last year when Prakash hosted his NowFest, which really, I actually wrote it down because it was so simple, was you said at that time, we need to always look at problems from the perspective of the user or the person concerned. And I was just like, oh, holy, it's just so simple, and yet it's so often not followed. So Param, for our members, maybe you could just talk about your journey into design, and then reflecting on that phrase, sort of tell us the things that are important to you and your particular insights in design these days.
Sure, fantastic, thank you. Just tell me if I ramble too much. Let me try and see how I can cover it without going too much off topic. But my background is design, in the sense that I started my career back in the mid-90s in the world of human-computer interaction, or what is called interaction design. At that time, it was an emerging field at that point of time. It was an early discipline that was emerging in a way very similar to what behavior science is today. It's been around for some time in the academic world for a few decades, but then is breaking into the industry and sort of the practitioner or the applied realm. And so interaction design was similar at that time. So that was my first sort of foray into design. I was lucky when I graduated from design school, the internet had just started, in India and pretty much around the world. And so I got fascinated with the idea of how people interact with technology and, the internet sort of applications. Anyway, long story short, from there, I practiced interaction design for a few years, about 7-8 years. And then in the early 2000s, I found a lot of blogs online and a lot of reading stuff that I was reading online. I came upon human-centered design, about IDEO, and about this world of design ethnography. And I got fascinated with that. I said, okay, this is why I got into design. This made a lot more sense to me. And up until then, as an interaction designer, because interaction design was still emerging as a field at that time, we were focused more on more on the solution design side, in the sense, thinking about how the interaction of the user interfaces were. We were thinking about not just the look and feel, but we were still scratching the surface when it came to thinking about user centricity. But when I read about human-centered design and design ethnography, I said, this really calls me, right? I read about people like Jan Chipchase. I don't know if how many of you are familiar with him. He was a fairly big celebrity design ethnographer, among the first few celebrity design ethnographers in the world. At that time, he was with Nokia. He was profiled by New York Times. It was fascinating. I mean, that whole world. And so I got fascinated with that, and I said, this is my calling. And I started moving towards that kind of design ethnography, design research, and human-centered design in a more holistic sense. And then long story short, I eventually started my own company in 2007 in India with a crazy and a stupid idea at that time, that I would start something like an IDEO in India, because IDEO was not there at that time. I burnt a lot of my money as an entrepreneur, and I was terrible at it. I was just horrible. And I closed down my company in less than 2 years. But this was 2007. I mean, way before design thinking became as mainstream as it is today, way before design ethnography and things like that became sort of more mainstream as they are today. So that's what I started. And yeah, I mean, the company was a failure, but the idea stuck. And eventually I came back to doing entrepreneurship, which is something that I really love, working in companies, getting paid for it, and doing what I love doing, and starting initiatives from scratch. Yeah, so over the last 10 to 12 years, I've been working in a variety of different companies, where I've set up a design thinking and innovation sort of capability. For the last 5 years before Fractal, I was at Dr. Reddy's, where I set up helped set up an innovation lab called Studio 5B. And the idea was to bring more patient centricity into healthcare and into pharmaceutical, into the medicine world, and to try and make how do we make medicines more thinking of it from a patient perspective, from a people perspective. That was one of the things that we focused on. And I did that for about 5. Worked on digital health, worked on a bunch of different things in Dr. Reddy's. Before that, I was at IDEO, and then last 2.5 years I've been at Fractal, which is an analytics and AI consulting and product company, where I lead a fantastic team of design specialists as well as behavior science specialists. And this has been my first sort of acquaintance in a more deeper sense into the world of behavior science in the last 2.5 years. Out of 65 people in our team, we have about close to 10 behavior science specialists. And this is not counting the ones who are coming from the more design ethnography world, design research world. That's another probably 10 or 12 people. So that's my world of design. I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
That's great, Param. Thank you. Very interesting to hear your journey into design, and you've designed all your life, as it were, extremely experienced in the area. And what is it that inspires you these days? I mean, what keeps somebody like you inspired to keep thinking of new ways, new ventures into design? What is it that inspires you?
So, I mean, there's so much, right? I mean, there's, it sounds like I'm an old fog. I've been around for 25 years or whatever, but I mean, I think for me, there's still so much that we are learning about human behavior. There is so much that we are understanding about why people do what they do. There is so much. I mean, there is so much of untapped knowledge there. And I mean, right from the early 2000s when I started working in the area of design ethnography, did the proverbial 10,000 hours of field work and, meeting consumers, meeting people in all walks of life, trying to understand why people do what they do. It just teaches you so much. And then in the last few years, with the world of behavior science opening up, I think I'm beginning to learn again and unlearn some. And, there's so much to learn and unpack there, right? But I think in general, what I'm passionate about is about, how do we make organizations more focused on solving problems from a people perspective? That's what I'm really passionate about. I think fundamentally, most companies, at least the progressive ones in the last 5 to 10 years, have realized that they've become detached from their consumers or their customers whom they, solve, whom they are sort of providing solutions for, be it a product or a service. And so now they're beginning to realize that they need to get a lot closer to them. They need to get a lot more, really focused on what do people care about. Even if you look at the world of employee engagement opening up in the last few years, now companies are beginning to realize that it's not just the customers as people, but it's also employees. How do we create organizations that are people-centric? So for everything, it all boils down to, do we really understand people and what they're looking for, what do they need? And not just what they're saying, what they need, but really what do they actually need? And so that process of understanding the problem and solving for it, to me, is fundamentally what design is. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I love focusing on.
And you mentioned there the word people-centric, which brought back in my memory the actual design problem that you were talking about back last year with Prakash, which was when you were actually talking about the ladies' toilets it was in India.
Yeah.
With the female workers there, and not recognizing the way in which they liked to gather together.
Yeah.
And that again fascinated me, because it just makes us think of all the times that design gets it wrong by not thinking about the user. Why is this, Param? How does this continue to be that so many design things actually are designed not really for the user?
I think, look, the thing is, everybody is always designing. Everyone, right? We keep saying this in the design world, that everything is design. Whether you think about it, so it's not that only designers are designing. Designers get it wrong, of course, many times, and we're still sort of figuring that out, learning. But there are, anyone who's in the process of solving a problem is in a way designing. At least that's how we in the design world think about it. So I think the reason we get it wrong is because we ended up focusing on the wrong problem. It's as simple as that, right? In the context of that toilet example, the problem was framed as, how can we, probably, right? I'm just hypothesizing from the outside, not having been in that project, but from the outside, it looks like the problem that they focused was on how do we create clean, hygienic toilets for women who work on construction sites. What they didn't realize, or the way they should have framed the problem, could have been that, how do we create safe, hygienic, clean toilets, and create, enable a sense of community among the female construction workers. That was the second part of it, was the bigger need that they felt, and that mattered more to them than having hygienic, clean toilets. And so I think it boils down to that. How are you framing the problem, and therefore, how are you thinking about, therefore, what are you solving for? Because ultimately, what you solve for will start from, how do you look at the problem, right? So. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there was a thread maybe it was in Twitter or LinkedIn, I'm not really certain, but it was along the lines of the problem that you've mentioned. And it was, how is it that behavioral scientists don't seem to follow their own advice when it comes to their own design, be it presentations or as you say, Paramaswaran, we are all designing all the time, you know, when we're putting, whether it's just putting documents together or how we frame our language in an email. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction, Param. I'm going to hand over now to Prakash for a chat with you, and then we'll be bringing in the members who've all kindly joined us today for their questions. So over to you, Prakash. Thanks very much, Param.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise and Param. People who have joined in from different corners of the world. I can see Sarah also. I saw Sarah some time back too. For folks, we have people right now from different corners, including Afghanistan. People in Australia are sleeping. It might be too early for people in Hawaii and all, but more or less the globe is pretty much covered. Thank you all for joining in. Especially folks from India, it's almost 9:47 in the night. You could be out drinking and partying, but you are here, so this is fun. I appreciate you all coming in out here. Param, thank you so much for joining in. Big fan. One curiosity, yeah, and it might be a very dumb question to begin with. Are we at peak design thinking, phenomena right now? Has design thinking hit the peak, or there is still a long way to go before we hit the peak? Where are we right now?
Well, I wish I could predict the future, but it's certainly the peak of, in the time that I've been practicing and, learning design. So if I look at the last 25 odd years, it's definitely at the peak of that time. I think I would say if you look at it in a more broader sense, maybe 20, 30 years from now, hopefully if everything goes well, it'll probably look like we've not peaked yet. Because I think the ones who've adopted and really accepted design today are the early adopters, in my opinion. There are some people, whether it's CEOs or other senior execs, more and more of them are beginning to ask for design thinking. And really, initially it was more of the buzz that, okay, design thinking is this cool thing that we should all embrace and we should adopt. Let's train 30,000 people in our company and teach them design thinking. I think there was that buzz about 5 years back. Thankfully, that buzz has, I think it is slowly reduced. And now it's getting into a little more maturity where people are beginning to, I know, and a lot of CEOs or CXOs that I speak with are asking for it now, but in a more meaningful, in a more patient, in a more committed way. It's not so superficial anymore. It's more meaningful to say, how do we actually drive change and thinking about consumers or user centricity or people centricity through design? And so that's beginning to change now. So I would imagine that in another 10 to 20 years from now, hopefully, what looks like its peak today is probably just an initial part of the journey to the peak.
So now, if we take this same discussion a little forward, right? What is the road like from here to a future where we have a lot more Param? And you are one of the best minds in the country, in the world of design. So what is the road
Hashtag like? Too much pressure.
All right. You are an average okay mind, fine. All right. No, I mean, you are one of the best minds in the country. We all know that. The question here is, if you look around, right, there is Param, and then it becomes very difficult to find people of a similar stature in the field who can lead this field, take this field to this new direction that you talk about. Most of us probably are just beginners and are in nascent stages of their career for people who are interested. And then in a country like India, unfortunately, engineering has a lot of gravitational pull. The best talented minds, they're just sucked in by engineering as a discipline. And on the other side is the question of the work aspect. where you need to have a good amount of understanding from decision makers and stakeholders to say, I think we need to have a different perspective out here. I think we need to bring in what they call design thinking. So both of them connected, right? How do you see that road, next 5, 10, 15 years? Very India specific question. Yeah, but I thought you would be able to help us understand that better.
So I mean, I think in India, but even the world over, I think India is not that far behind the rest of the world. If I were to look at it from the sense that the business world is, adopting and accepting design thinking in the last 5 to 10 years phenomenally well. And India is behind, of course, comparatively in terms of quantity, but is not that far behind. And so I would say, if you take an anecdotal evidence, right? If I go to LinkedIn online today and I search for jobs for design thinking or design ethnography or design research or any of these sort of allied terms that you use, or even behavior science, you will see a fair amount of jobs out there for these kind of roles. 5 years back, it was much lesser. 10 years back, it was almost non-existent. And so I mean, for me, that's one of the best indicators of is there more broader acceptance and adoption of what we're talking about. I mean, that's one of the indicators, not the only, but that's telling us a lot about that. Then the other is, of course, how many people are getting into this at the graduate level, at the postgraduate level. How many people are studying these disciplines and going abroad or going to or even within the country, and those numbers are all anecdotally just rising up like crazy. So I think this is the start of something big. It's going to get much bigger, and I think as business and I see many more anecdotally, again, I see so many CEOs or CXOs now consciously themselves asking for a design thinking lab or a team or a studio, whatever you want to call it. And so it is becoming more and more common, and it's not because someone is convincing them or they themselves are beginning to ask for it. And so even at Fractal, for example, the idea of setting up a design effort was the idea of one of our co-founders, Shrikant. And it's so, similarly with my previous job at Dr. Reddy's, it was the CEO who felt the need for starting an innovation lab with a design-centric approach, Mr. Prasad. So, I mean, these are the kind of people who are now there in the world, and this is not uncommon. It's definitely still an early adopters, but definitely it's becoming more and more common.
Thank you, Param. One question connected again to this around adoption. One thing which I noticed personally at work, and I also had similar stories which is shared with me by our peers in the industry here, was while there is an appreciation which is slowly, which is there right now, in decision makers, the people who are running consumer insights department or innovation department. There is also a certain, possibly the status quo of running businesses or the change being too much, where you have requests which come in saying, I want to get something done in 2 weeks,
right,
on something in 3-4 weeks. Have you had similar experiences while working with clients or directly in your own roles? And what would be a way forward for people who are in this group right now to help the client navigate through the transition period? At one point of time, they possibly are going to say, I think it's a 3-month, 6-month long project. But today, I think we are at this junction. How can we bridge this gap?
Great question. I don't know if I have the magic bullet answer to that, but let me give you some of my thoughts on that. Look, I think I've seen over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. If I look at the last 20 years from a longitudinal perspective, the average duration of a project. When I say a project, I mean, let's say the project was how do we understand the needs of construction site workers, and from a hygiene and safety, I mean from a sanitation perspective. If that was the brief that was given, the amount of time that a client would give you, or a company would give you for doing that kind of work 10, 15, 20 years back versus now, I would bet that there's a dramatic reduction in the amount of time that is available right now. That has shrunk definitely over the last decade and two. And it is going to continue to get more and more aggressive. And I think the reason for that is not so much to do with money, but I think it's the pace of change that I think is happening in the world of the business, or the world of business, or the world at large. So I think it's more to do with, it's less to do with the economics of it. It's more to do with the rate of change, the level of ambiguity, and the level of iterations that need to happen in the business world, and the number of cycles that people are dealing with, and things changing every literally 6 months or every year. I mean, in some industries or categories, it's probably every 3 months or every month. So I think the rate of change is really what is driving it. That being said, I personally feel that it's not a threat, it's an opportunity. And the reason why I say that is it requires us as practitioners to be able to look at our methods and look at our ways of approaching the problem in a whole different way than what we were used to doing, for these last 5, 10, 20, 30 years. To give you an example, earlier we would have the luxury of, pre-COVID also, forget about 20 years back or 15 years back, even pre-COVID, most of us would have thought about doing a study of consumers or people by recruiting them, going and spending time with them, doing a lot of different methods, mixed methods, whatever you want to throw into that. And, coming back, doing some synthesis, then doing a share out and report out of those insights. Easily 8 to 10, 12 weeks, if you're lucky, 16 weeks, if the client is really, if that's an outlier situation. But now post-COVID, you're expected to, I mean, there is no option. You're doing that remote. You're not even going and meeting people, in the context, in that situation where it matters. So we've had to rethink how we do stuff, and we've had to, go with the context. I think that will continue to accelerate. I mean, that's one context about COVID, but I'm saying even beyond COVID, we need to rethink our methods. We need to get a lot more agile. We need to start figuring out how do we balance. And for me, agile doesn't necessarily mean we are diluting the process or the methods. I think there is a way to think about methods in a way that we don't dilute the rigor, and yet do something that is, a little less time consuming than it used to be earlier. I mean, to me, the analogy that I'll give is, it's like if you look at the world of photography, there were film cameras, there were film-based cameras, or most of the photography, all the photography was shot on film 100 years back or whatever number of decades back. It slowly transitioned to many other methods. In fact, 100 years back, photography was done only by experts. Only experts knew how to handle the camera, how to handle the film. The film had to go through a complicated process of production, and then it would go to the darkroom and get produced into a film. It slowly got democratized when Kodak first came up with the film. Then again, a few decades later, when digital happened, it started, Kodak got disrupted, and then, the technology companies started making it more shareable, and that became more relevant for people. It was not the quality of the resolution of the film anymore. It was about, can you share the picture? Sharing the picture became more important than the quality and the resolution of the film or of the photo. So I think as times change, we have to start figuring out what is it that really matters to people and customers or stakeholders in that era. And so when we look at it as practitioners, it might look like we are diluting the quality of what we are talking about, but I think that's the wrong lens to which we look at it. If we look at it through that lens alone, we might miss the boat. We might, we might become redundant even, I would say, if I had to be provocative. Yeah.
Thank you, Param. I'm getting greedy here. What I would really love to do is probably work on a documentary or a book, talking with you, collecting stories of how India and the world out here has changed last 15, years. These are the formative years of this industry. So it will be lovely to have that record. God willing, universe willing, that will happen one day. But let me invite Louise in now. We have lovely questions from the audience. Louise is going to help with the moderation. Louise, all yours.
Thanks so much, Prakash. And yes, I think myself and Prakash would like to just chat with you ourselves for the rest of the time. But we've had some great questions already from our members who've joined us today. So first of all, I'd like to bring in Shruti, who had a very good question about using behavioral science in design, if you'd like to join us.
Yes. Hi, sir. Thank you so much for joining and speaking with us today. I'm actually a student of behavioral science. I'm pursuing my master's at the University of Pennsylvania right now. And I'm curious to know from your extensive experience, could you share like a specific example of a time when you used behavioral science at the need finding stage and then translated that need into a product design? The reason I asked this question really is because I was working in India and where I saw clients were always motivated to use nudges, almost using that term, synonymously with behavioral science, although it's not, but only for incremental improvements. And they remain very hesitant to use it, in a systematic way of thinking about foundational business challenges. And then application of behavioral science in need finding then becomes like applying it right at the roots. So if you have any specific examples to share, I would be really curious to know that.
Sure. Quite a few, there are a bunch of things that have been going on. Maybe I can share one example that's coming to my mind right now. We were working with a large bank, that has credit cards as one of their main products. And, the question that they had asked us was that, why do consumers not sign up for autopay? Right? And autopay, as you all know, is basically the feature where your payments get automatically debited from your account every month on the given date. And so that's what consumers sign up for. So the bank wanted to, have more people sign up for autopay. And so we looked at this problem through a behavior science and design lens. And there are a bunch of insights that we uncovered after sort of really understanding the context of why, what happens when people are signing up for autopay. What are their broader financial goals, and how do they look at their decisions around money? And sort of more broader lens, and then more specifically around what happens when it comes to autopay. A lot of insights, but one of them was about the idea of losing control, essentially, right? Control and power. So one is, of course, we realized that there are, I think if I remember correctly, 3 segments of people that we identified. One segment was people who pay on time. They are, the good guys, or the good people. They pay they make the payments on time. They don't need reminders. They don't need autopay actually. In a way, they also can need autopay, but the point is they felt that they don't need autopay because they anyway make the payments on time. Right. So those are the obedient, the disciplined folks rather. The second category is the lapsers and the people who roll over credit and they're not so disciplined. They are the ones who actually need autopay. But they don't like autopay because it feels that they're losing control, because they don't know how much money is going to get debited. What if the statement that month was the wrong statement and they were charged extra for something else that they didn't buy? There's that sense of losing control. So how did we? And again, there's a whole bunch of other things that we uncovered, but just to give you a nugget. And so we translated that insight and learning into the way we thought about how to communicate to different people about what does autopay mean. So we had to reframe and develop a choice architecture for how people think about autopay, right? So for the person who's lapsing or not lapsing, but rather rotating money regularly and not disciplined, instead of saying, here's an autopay feature, sign up for it or not, pretty much that was the only options that they were given earlier in the emailer that was sent to them. We developed options. We said, here's an option. Option one, you can auto debit the entire amount of your credit card statement that month. That's an option. Option two is you can debit just the minimum, not the whole amount, but just the minimum. That's one option. And the third option is, of course, not having auto pay at all or whatever. So these are 3 or 4 options that we came up with. And obviously that makes it a lot more palatable. And of course, as behavior science experts, you know that choice architecture makes it a lot more, palatable to people, because then it's not a yes or no binary kind of thing. So, and so based on those emotional needs that we identified and context that we sort of understood, then we translated that into the final touch points that the consumers interacted with. And that had a dramatically better uptake in terms of people converting to auto pay usage. So that is one use case that I can think of.
Great. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question, Shruti. And I'm just smiling to myself because with these behavioral science problems, they're always the most mundane, aren't they? And the ones that's I think that's the beauty of behavioral science is whatever problem we're discussing, you can put yourself in that position and relate to it. So next I'm going to invite in somebody who's very excited to be talking to you. It's Arvind. If you'd like to join us, Arvind, with your question.
Chandrasekhar.
Yes, long time no see, no hear.
I'm seeing Arvind after maybe 10 years.
Yeah, it's been a very long time, and I really need to get in touch with you and need your brains a lot more than what this forum is going to allow me. But coming to my question, and this is a question that rings from our time together, so have you sort of found a solution or a stopgap solution to the communication problem, to what design researchers or design ethnographers use versus the other folks? And because research sort of coalesces with every other department, and they need to be multilingual in nature when it comes to speaking the language which other departments understand and use. So I was just curious, because that's a problem that you and me were facing for a fairly long time, and I'm still struggling with it. So I was just wondering if I could just, pause something off.
So do you mean the language between, you mean between behavior science or design research practitioners and non-behavior science and non-design practitioners, or are you saying within
all three
Okay.
included? Because the design researchers they understand the concepts in a fairly different manner in which behavioral fellows speak of the same concepts.
Yes, absolutely. I think, again, I don't have a complete sort of watertight answer to that, but I'll tell you what I've learned in the last few years as I've been trying to figure that out. First and foremost, even when I was and still I'm practicing some amount of design ethnography, I have tried to, over the years, reduce the amount of jargon and technical terms that we use with non-practitioners. When you're doing some work for a client or for a business, and you're trying to solve a problem using design and design thinking and design research or whatever, finally, when you go to them and tell them this is the insight, here's what the consumer is actually dealing with, and this is the problem, you have to speak in normal English. If a 10-year-old child can't understand it, then the client is not going to understand it. Now, of course, in the world of consulting, there's a fair amount of focus on using terminologies and expert speak so that you can sound credible or come across as more credible, and you're using some method to the madness. But I don't believe in that philosophy, to be honest. I've been in consulting for a long time, out of my 25 odd years. And so I've always found it useful to just de-jargonize it and explain it in normal language. And then, of course, if someone is interested, you can tell them about the theory behind it and the principles behind it and the approach you took to get there. But fundamentally, it's more about did you help them reframe the problem? That's what is more important. So that's my general philosophy, even before behavior science happened in my life. Once behavior science happened in my life, I've realized that yes, there is a vocabulary, not a problem, but there are vocabulary differences. What a behavior science person calls choice architecture means something, or actually probably doesn't even exist in the vocabulary of a non-designer behavioral science practitioner. And even in the world of design ethnography, we never use the word choice architecture. But I think it's about, I think one is all the three parties have to learn and embrace these worlds, or at least be familiar with them to some extent, right? Like I'm not an expert in behavioral science methods as much as some of my team members in my team who are behavioral science experts who studied it and have practiced it. But I've learned a little bit. I've learned enough to make sense out of it and to connect the dots between how behavioral science helps or applies in the broader context of the entire human-centered design sort of problem-solving approach. So that's how I see it. I think it's about, sorry, long story short, but I think it's really about de-jargonizing. The methods are, the terminologies are relevant for us as practitioners when we discuss among ourselves. But when we finally talk to a non-practitioner or someone else, we have to simplify it.
All right, and I will ping you and annoy you as always, as I'm known to. So do look forward to that. Cheers.
Glad some things don't change. Yeah.
Never.
But I think to the point about the world of design ethnographers and behavior science people, yes, I think that's something that I'm beginning to learn about, how to connect the dots between those two, how to bring those two together also. We've learned a lot of that, made a lot of mistakes. A few things that I'm beginning to learn, for example, I think the crux of it is about how do you draw specialization and distinction between the two, and yet make both sides of I don't like to say both sides, but both parties aware that fundamentally both are trying to solve the same thing. Design ethnographers care about human behavior and are trying to get to reframing problems and looking at problems from an end user perspective. Behavior science people are trying to do pretty much that, trying to understand why people do what they do, and solving problems in a way that matter to people's needs, appealing to people's needs or relevant to people's needs and designed for people, right? It's just that the means to get there is where the differences are. And in my opinion, those differences are actually opportunities to complement each other. For example, I've seen that design researchers are fantastic at doing qualitative interviewing. Behavior scientists, and what I'm going to say is generic. There are exceptions to every rule, but in general, I'm saying, right? Behavior science folks are not that deep. Most of them I don't see as being so deep in qualitative research interviewing. So likewise, the opposite is true, which is, design researchers don't spend too much time doing literature review or looking at how the brain works and thinking about needs that are not in the realm of articulated needs. Behavior science folks are great at that. So I think there's a lot of complementary sort of skills and values and beliefs that are aligned here. And it's about getting both of that to work together. Behavior science folks are great at explainability. Design ethnographers are brilliant at empathy. You need both. In my opinion, you need both for solving problems. It's not either or. So I think those are some things that I've learned over the last few years.
Thank you so much, Arvind, for joining us. If people missed the chat during that conversation, Prakash called that a lovely reunion of men with magnificent beards. So thank you, Arvind. So yeah, and absolutely, we're all nodding there, Param, with your comments about jargon and technical terms, which are an ongoing problem. I don't know if it's myself being able to accept my own ignorance, but all I seem to say these days is I don't even know what that means. And I think there's a terrible problem with jargon. So following on quite well to that conversation, Jaffer, if you'd like to join us, you had a question about working with engineering teams.
Hey, Louis. Hey, Param. Hi, nice to see you here.
Hi, Jaffer.
Really strange that we hardly or never spoke at Fractal, and very strangely, Arvind is now my current colleague. Right?
Nice.
Very small. So my question is, Param, that behavioral science itself had a journey, and still it's an ongoing journey of convincing people that it's important, it's relevant, it's cool. And it came from the whole psychology, and then combining with economics, then, you know, sociology, ethnography, everything. And design is also going through its own journey, right? And suddenly now, in teams like yours at Fractal, what you're trying to do is combine all this again with engineering and AI, right? And now suddenly it might be a situation, let us know how it is, right? That the different teams are getting exposed to design thinking and behavioral sciences at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's a whole mix of things, right? Like Faluda.
Yeah.
So how are you handling that? How are you communicating that? And how is the response been? Any learnings from trying to do and take so many lenses and use them simultaneously, right? And not just experiment and learn, but also convince the clients that these are all relevant lenses to use at the same time.
Yeah. Great question. So, I mean, look, I think we are still on the learning curve. Let me put that out there first and foremost. There is a journey that we're on, and we've learned a lot in the last 2 or 3 years. But I think there's a huge long way to go. I think there's some interesting opportunities that we've uncovered, which are, you know, the way I see it is that, you know, engineering and AI and design or behavior science practitioners, good thing is all of them love problem solving. That is one thing that binds everyone together. It's about how they're looking at that problem and how they're looking at this problem solving process. That is where the divergences are, or the differences are. Number one. Number two, I think the good thing is that when you look at the world of AI and engineering and design and behavior science, the world of AI and engineering tends to be, again, I'm stereotyping, but you know, there are exceptions, but for the most part, the world of AI and engineering folks is very analytical, it's very logical, very data, you know, based on data evidence, and it's quantitative, and you know, all of that sort of, you know, typically the stereotypical or proverbial left brain sort of stuff, which I don't agree, but you know, traditionally that's what it's known to be. The world of design and behavioral science is talking about emotions. It's talking about how people feel. It's about why people do what they do, not based on facts or evidence or logic, but based on emotions. And so these two, therefore, you know, it's very distinctive and yet complementary. You need both. No one is going to say, I can do with just one. And so I think they naturally lend themselves to come together. That's the good news. The bad news is, of course, as you know, when people start working together from these different disciplines, if the respect for interdisciplinary thinking is not there, that's where there is friction. So what I've generally seen, and you know, what I've experienced is that when the person who's working in the team is T-shaped, as IDEO used to call it, and has that, you know, propensity to think in an interdisciplinary way, or is open to that, then the chemistry works well, and then the integration works well, and then there is magic. But if the people are not interdisciplinary in their thinking, or are not open to that, or one-dimensional in their approach from a disciplinary standpoint, then there is friction, and then there are questions about, but why do we need this, or why do we do that, or whatever. So that's been my experience. For the most part, it's been going good. I think we've been able to grow our team significantly over the last year, especially because the integration is beginning to work well. I won't say we've cracked it. I won't say we don't have days of friction. We do, and there are challenges, but for the most part, it's been going in the positive direction. Yeah.
Nice to hear that. Thanks, Param.
Thanks so much for joining us, Jafar. That was an excellent question. Really enjoyed your response to that, Param. Shum, you had a question which was rather nice to follow on from that, which was about things that Param may have seen with novice designers. Would you like to ask your question next?
Yeah, hi, Param. So the organization I'm currently working at is growing its design team. And since you have built so many design teams, I think it's a good question for you. So my question is essentially about how do you behaviorally design a design team, right? There are a lot of things, bad habits, what I'm calling them, that a lot of junior designers may pick up, which I've been observing over the past few years at my org. And when they are going into senior positions or slightly, the senior designer or even team leads, they're sort of carrying those habits with them. And that's affecting obviously the entire org. And as org is growing, it's harder to cull these things at an individual level. So have you noticed or tried solving such a similar problem while growing a team, like behaviorally?
Can you give me firstly, that's a great meta level question, but what do you mean by a bad habit? Can you give me an example of what you mean so that I can understand better about what you're asking? What's an example of a bad habit?
So very simple. You are not the user, right? As a designer.
Right.
That's often missed out.
Okay.
So I work for one of those large IT services companies, right? And
no,
they
I
often
got
don't
it.
do.
Yeah, I got it. Yes, I understood now what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, look, I think there are two schools of thought in the world out there, right? Not just in the design world, but even more broadly out there. There is that school of thought which says, don't ask people what they want, just give them what we think they need, and they will, they will respond to it. And then, it's that whole very, very done to death Henry Ford quote, which says, don't ask people what they want. They would have told you they want faster horses. I wish somebody would add an addendum to that saying, that's a stupid question to ask in the first place. But unfortunately, that has become popular. So there is that world of people, that school of thought, who follow that school of thought, and there are the others like us who are more thinking about, you can't solve a problem or even begin to solve a problem without first understanding what do people really, what are people actually trying to do, or what is it that matters to them, or why they do what they do. So I mean, the good thing is generally the latter world is increasing in proportion now in the last 10 years, 20 years. It's been dramatically going up, both in the world of design as well as outside of that in the world of business and so on. So I think that journey is going to happen. It's going to take some time. I don't know if it's bad habits, but it's the two different schools of thought. That's what it actually boils down to. I mean, frankly, in my case, maybe it's a question of self-selection, right? When I have built design teams over the last several years, I look for people of the latter variety. So in a way, I don't have that problem because, if it was people who were in the former school of thought, it wouldn't align with the way we are trying to build a design team. So we would not have that problem, generally speaking. Yeah. But yes, I know that problem exists in the broader world out there. How do you deal with that? I think you have to, get people out of their office space. You have to get them out of their computers. You have to get them out of their cubicles, or working from home, whatever they're doing, and just get them out into the real world. I think that's the best way that I've seen the hardest nuts crack. Not just designers, but even CEOs or CXOs. It makes people realize that their assumptions and their current idea of reality and what they think people do and how different the world is on the ground is so, it's so stark. You don't need to convince them. You just need to get them there. That experience will change them, hopefully. In most cases, it does happen. I've seen that firsthand many, many times. I've seen CEOs and very senior level people remember consumers' names years later, years after they met them, not just a few months later. That's the extent to which they remember the stories, because stories stick in people's head. Once you experience something and once you have a story, you won't forget that. So I think that's the way I would approach it to answer your question.
Thanks. That's great, because storytelling is a skill I'm trying to build myself. So this will be excellent. Try out.
Just get them out of the office. Get them to go and meet people. That's the best way.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Great question, Shum. And that's reminded me of a picture I think I saw in LinkedIn this week. And it was a very senior member of one of the food delivery companies, the bicycle delivery companies. And she was out with her rain gear on and going out, as you say, there's nothing that you can learn more than just getting on the ground and putting your product into practice. Now, there was a question a little while back from Abraham. Would you like to ask your question? Again, it's on a similar subject, sort of develops on the conversation about the user-centric approach to problem solving. Are you still with us? Possibly not. I'll read the question. It sort of follows on in the flow of the conversation. Abraham was asking, is the user-centric approach to problem solving being adopted more with digital products and system design compared with other domains of design? So we're talking now, he suggested industrial design, visual communication. So it's the different types of design and whether the user-centric approach to problem solving is being adopted more in certain fields.
Maybe yes, to some extent, purely because there is more money that's going in the world of digital, and there is more adoption of design in general because of that, right? I mean, so I think it's because of that to some extent, but I mean, is there need for more user centricity in the world of industrial design or visual communication? Yes. I would argue everywhere in every world, in every discipline. So yeah, but the reality right now is that yes, there is a lot more investment going into digital products and system design, and therefore there is more user centricity being adopted because of that.
And Divya, are you still with us? Because that's a perfect opportunity to bring you in to ask your question and talk about your product. Are you still with us, Divya?
I have lots of familiar
Great,
faces
you're
of
very
people that I'm meeting
welcome.
up with you.
Hi,
Hi,
Param.
Divya.
Hope all is well. So, quick question. So, we've been talking about large IT services firms and large organizations. CEOs remember consumer names. Now, if you quickly change the lens to startups who are in kind of a build, break, rebuild kind of mode because they've got things to prove, money to make, funding to get, etc. I have found that pushing the cause for research is a bit counterproductive. So most of the research that I suggest or I do is linked to stuff that the founders are talking to customers themselves. I talk to customers myself, and we sort of in a slightly disjointed, unstructured way, we bring it all into the product. So what's your kind of advice for such such organizations? What can be best done to leverage research, build in the behavior science, learning, thinking, principles, etc. Because those parts they're still open to, but the need for that much of research to go into to making those decisions, that's the part which gets a little tricky or a little, I wouldn't say murky, but it's a little tricky to convince them about that, right?
Yeah.
So what is your advice?
Look, I think I'm sure you're trying many of these things already, but let me share a few top of the mind ones. One is, I think, maybe talking less about research. The moment people hear the word research, I think people get scared. They start imagining large surveys or questionnaires or qualitative studies or whatever, and so I think that itself puts people off. And so the entrepreneur who's running that company will probably start imagining dollars and whatever, or rupees, and starting to immediately you've already lost him at that point, him or her. So I would say maybe we should stop using the word research. And I think the bigger point, I think what they need actually is empathy, is really understanding what their consumers or customers are trying to do and what their needs are. That will appeal more to CEOs or entrepreneurs, right? If you don't get the product market fit right, you're not going to survive. It's as simple as that. So I would language it more in that context, which is how can I help you get to product market fit faster? Right? And now, how will I get there is through a bunch of different methods that will involve, and again, I'll not use the word research. I will say, come along with me and let's go meet some customers. or I'll come with you and I'll meet some customers. And or for that matter, looking at longitudinal data through, existing data that's available, transactional data or whatever, and forming some hypothesis, or doing some, and maybe the third thing I would say is probably ask for forgiveness, not permission, which is just go ahead and do it. Don't tell anyone that you're doing it, and then and share the insights that are coming up from that. Like I remember sharing with the CEO of a startup. This was like 12 years back. They were building a HR platform for engineering hiring engineers in India. It was a large platform that they were building with AI and all sorts of things thrown into it to try and improve the speed of hiring for engineers, especially software engineers. And in my so-called research with engineering students who are graduating from engineering college to get into the workforce, what I found, that this was 2007 or 8, was that there was an increasing detachment from the world of software engineering, at least in the big cities in India. And I started seeing there was an early adopter trend of people not wanting to get into software engineering because it was no longer cool. And so I didn't share the insight with the CEO. I just said, what if you are going to end up having a market where software engineers don't want to be software engineers, and it's no longer cool to be a software engineer? And that got him hooked, and he said, "Oh, how did you where did you learn that?" And that's pretty provocative. So I guess it's about framing in some ways. I think that's the other piece. The last thing I'll say is, I think before I engage with, if I'm taking up a job somewhere, one of the things that I look for is fundamentally that commitment and alignment with this so-called human-centered way or behavioral science-led way of thinking. If that doesn't exist already as a precondition at the C-level, then there's no point in me going and convincing someone. It's not going to happen. At least it would happen, but it's going to take far too long and far too much effort. I wouldn't, I don't want to put in that kind of effort. I would rather have a minimum amount of alignment before I go there. So that's the last thing that I've learned over the years.
Right. So there was an interesting point which you made about how behavior scientists tend to be, again, I don't like using left brain, right brain, but I'm going to use it anyway. They tend to be left-brained, and they don't have the qualitative sense. I guess that's also because there's so much of behavior science has grown out of behavioral economics, right? That is the source of everything, and economists are quantitative in nature. And which is what I also find challenging sometimes, because I am fundamentally a qualitative researcher who's just sort of jumped into behavior science and building an expertise around that. So I keep wanting to not suggest too much qualitative research and say, okay, let me focus on the behavior science principles and understand it from the data and suggest, reasons why they should include a feature or drop something and things like that. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for that answer. Great connecting again.
Thanks, Divya. That was a really interesting conversation. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. So much more that we would like to chat with you about, Param. But unfortunately, that will have to be saved for another day. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. It's been really interesting hearing all of your responses. And so I'll just hand back now to Prakash to close the event. Thank you, all of you, for joining us again this week.
Thank you all for joining us from different parts of the world. I think we have 2 sessions remaining more this year. The next 2 weeks, December is going to be quiet because there's something really big, something really noisy which will happen in December. So we need the quiet for contrast. You'll get to know about it soon. Param, thank you so much for joining in. It was lovely to hear this point of view about, I hadn't noticed this, I was not aware of it. Behavioral science or behavioral economists guys have been very big on qual kind of makes sense. Although I can also see a protest by Jaffer, or maybe it's bragging. I think I'm a good qual researcher and I'm an economist by CAT training.
Yeah.
So this is good. This is really good. I think we're lucky here. The team led by my co-founder Reshma and Priyanka is a part of it. These guys are fantastic, at Qual. But I digress. Thank you so much, Param. Before you go, Any word of advice for us? Anything that you want to feel? You've seen the group by now. You've seen the spread. You know what our questions are like. You know our minds. So what is the one thing that you want to leave us? Any suggestions for us, or maybe more than one thing? Why not?
Yeah. I don't know. It's not word of advice. That's, I think, too grand an expectation for me. But I think we all need to help grow the overall discipline of people-centric problem solving. Right. I'm not calling it design. I'm not calling it behavioral science because I think we get too disciplinary focused. I think we need to break down the disciplinary walls. That's probably my word of not advice, but it's a plea to everyone, including people in the design world, that where I traditionally come from. So I think the more we break down these walls, the more our tribe will grow. That's probably the last bit.
Thank you so much, Farhan.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, stay safe. Wear your
Thank you.
mask on.
Thanks, everyone. Go forth and be people-centric problem solvers. And we'll see you next week. Bye now.
Thank you.